Welcome to the BrettJohnson.biz podcast, where we discuss business on purpose, radically fresh leadership, capital that transforms society, and marketplace stories that embolden difference makers. Welcome to the Repurposing Business podcast. I'm here with Wayne and Steve. Steve, I've known for many, many years, and we met back in 2003, and Steve has been a member of parliament for as long as I've known him. Prior to that, had a legal background, which he is still knowledgeable on the legal front, of course, has also done an economics degree and very active in the affairs of South Africa. He's with the ACDP, which Wayne is going to tell us about in a moment, I'm sure. Wayne, welcome. It's good to have you with us too.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited as we're doing this podcast series on investing with Africa, not investing just in Africa or for Africa. One is, how do I get a return? The other is, how do I help Africa? But seeing the vibrancy of what's happening in Africa, how do we partner with those who are already there and for centuries really have been doing amazing things? And so we'd love to just explore that with you. So I think we have Steve back. Steve, welcome.
Sorry about
again.
that, Brett. I was kicked off for a moment.
Yeah, it's good. We got to see Wayne's full face for a moment, which is fantastic. So that's good. So, Steve, I gave a little bit of your background, of course, having known you and Louise since 2003, and grateful for the work you've been doing in South Africa. Wayne, why don't you tell us a bit of your story, give us a bit of your background, and then update us on what you're doing right now. It'd be fantastic.
Sure. Well, I'll try to keep it as concise as possible. The Thring family starts with two brothers came from England to KwaZulu-Natal. And the one brother saw a lady who was chocolatey in color, and he fell in love with dark chocolate. And so he married Lily Dube. So those were my great-grandparents.
So Dube sounds like a Zulu name, right?
Yes, that's Zulu. So those were my great-grandparents. On my grandmother's side, we kind of have Ackerman and I think some Mauritian heritage there as well. So there's some Dutch Jewish background. So we are a mixture of many different races within the Thring clan. But for myself, born in a small area just outside of Durban called Sydenham, family of 5 children, and my dad was a bricklayer. Got through high school, completed my education diploma at Beshe Beshe Teachers Training College. Went on to teach. I taught maths and science for some 17 or so years. Completed a honors degree in psychology, and then also had the opportunity to complete a postgraduate diploma in economic principles with the University of London. Politically, I was involved in the struggles in the 1980s while I was still at college, Teachers Training College, and I worked with the United Democratic Front with Alan Busak, Archie Gomede, Trevor Manuel, Praveen Gordon. So those were kind of our mentors. I was a young man then, about 19 or so, 18, 19 years old at the time. And so, really fought against the apartheid regime during that period. 1984, I committed my life to Christ. And then politics took a back seat. It, just immersed myself in the work of the Lord and began just giving myself to the things of the kingdom. Eventually, the same church that I gave my life to Christ in is now the church that I'm pastoring. So that's some 42 years later. I'm still in the same church and now the senior pastor of that particular church. God has blessed us, my wife and I, with 3 children, Timothy, Esther, and Daniel. And we currently have 5 grandchildren, and still expecting.
Fantastic.
So 1984, was when I kind of left politics and I gave my heart to the Lord. 1995 is when the Lord called me back into politics. That's another chapter in itself. But 1995, while studying, God called me in our church, called me back into politics. The ACDP came knocking at my door, and the rest is history. So, yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. And Steve, perhaps you can tell us, because you've been involved with ACDP for a long time, or both of you, I don't know who's been involved the longest, but what does ACDP stand for?
Well, it stands for the African Christian Democratic Party that was founded towards the end of 1993, beginning of 94, the 94 elections by our leader, Reverend Kenneth Meshwe, after he believed and he received a real vision and a calling in that regard, which was confirmed by a number of church leaders. It's a political party that stands on Christian values. We do stand for freedom of religion, and we stand for Christian democratic principles, Judeo-Christian values, stewardship of state resources, servant leadership, honesty and integrity. And in the 1994 elections, having registered the party 100 days before the elections, we received 2 seats. And we've been consistently in Parliament. Reverend Kenneth Meshwe, an incredible leader, an inspirational leader. And we were reflecting on that yesterday, in fact, when we met with an African delegation from Tanzania, and just on the path we've walked and the miracle of South Africa since 1994. So, yes, we've been serving in Parliament. I've been there since 1999. And our deputy, Wayne Thring, has also been a councillor for many years. And now he's serving his second term in Parliament. So it's an honour to be in Parliament for so many years, and to have seen the peaceful transition in South Africa from 1994, reflecting on that answer to prayer, and then again with the Government of National Unity last year, which we must emphasize we're not part of, but we have seen an improvement in our fiscal outcomes and targeting and budgeting since the Government of National Unity. So that's a very brief background. As you know, I've got degrees in law and economics, so I serve on the Justice Portfolio Committee, I serve on the Finance Portfolio Committee, and I serve on Defence, and I'm a whip in Parliament. I serve on the Whips Forum and other leadership. And now I also serve on the Impeachment Committee. So
Yeah, I'm sure that's occupying your thinking. Yeah. Well, what's interesting about the South African political situation, you don't just have, like in the US, Democrats and Republicans. You've got quite a plethora of parties in South Africa. Wayne, how many parties are there roughly?
Oh my! I think serving in Parliament, Steve. I think we're looking at about 16 to 18 political parties. But outside of that, I think in the last election we had something like 80 to 100 political parties that had been registered with the IEC. So there are a large number. And normally, what happens is that just prior to an election, you have a number of new political parties also being formed. So as I'm speaking, I know that of one that is currently being established up in the north, that we also keeping our eye on. But it changes. It's very fluid, and it changes. Yeah.
So South Africans have got hold of the concept of democracy, and people can run for parliament. You don't have to be part, as I understand it, constitutionally, of a major party to even run as a member of parliament. I know
not anymore. Yes, not anymore. So previously, you had to be a part of a political party, but now legislation has been amended to allow for independent candidates also to stand.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. Now, back in 2018, I was in South Africa. I got asked to go to a meeting up in the Johannesburg area. There was a group of Christians who were talking about land reform. And of course, at that stage, the ANC, the African National Congress, was putting on the table the concept of land expropriation without compensation. Now, land expropriation with compensation has been around for quite a while, as I understand it. But now the proposal was that this was going to change. And so I listened to the conversation, and in early June, they sent me a document that they proposed to submit to Parliament to say this is a Christian perspective on this. And I looked at it, and they quoted one scripture, just one scripture. And I thought to myself, the ANC is not going to buy this. It's quite interesting. And my wife said to me, Brett, this is not your fight. Just, don't get involved in this over here. But I remember June 18th, I think, was the due date for submissions. And I shouldn't probably admit this, but on June 16th in the evening, I sat down and I started writing a book on This Land is Your Land, This Land is My Land, on the issue of what does Scripture say about land specifically. And it was a short book, of course, because I had to publish it by Friday to submit it along with my commentary to the ANC. That was on the 18th of June. I doubt that anybody in the ANC has read it. I've no idea. I've shared it with different people. Steve's seen it a long time ago. And my issue was just that Scripture speaks to this topic of land. And in the back of the book, I included 1,500 scriptures that deal with land, property rights, boundaries, etc., because this is a construct that's clear in Scripture and quite different from a socialist or communist or Marxist view, which has government owning things. And so land ownership is just key to economics. And so I put out that book back then just to introduce foundational principles on this concept of land. Now, I know but that both of you have been involved in land reform and rural development issues, and that since then the ANC has eventually pushed through legislation. So I wanted to just get your input on what you think about how this impacts economics in South Africa and investment confidence, and just what your take is, because people from the outside, this is a bit scary to outside investors when they think, yeah, we could put money in, but who knows what's going to happen after that. I'd love to get your perspectives on the way things are in South Africa, and I might not be up to date on the latest developments, so please enlighten me.
Steve, maybe if I could just kick off, and then you can come in and
sure.
So Brett, what essentially happened is that when the EFF was established, Economic Freedom Fighters in South Africa, it was an offshoot from the ANC, the ruling party at the time. The EFF's slogan, to a large extent, is "We want the land. We want the land back," and they created a lot of media hype around the land issue and placed huge pressure on the ANC, indicating that the ANC have failed the black people in particular by not restoring the land back to black South Africans. So this started with the EFF, and the ANC felt pressured to respond, and so the ANC responded by looking at amending the Section 25 of the Constitution. And I was a part of that ad hoc committee to look with a view to amending Section 25 of the Constitution to allow for expropriation without compensation. The ANC's view, the EFF's view, was that Section 25 of the Constitution, they wished to make explicit what is implicit in that expropriation with no compensation is possible and can be done. And so obviously there were lots of negotiations and debates around the issue, and our committee had to deal with all of these debates and negotiations. The EFF then took it a point further, and the EFF indicated that not only do they want expropriation of land without compensation, but the EFF in those negotiations indicated that they want land to be nationalized, land to become owned by the state. And so at the end of all of the inputs, public participation process, it came to Parliament, and the attempt by the ANC to amend Section 25 of the Constitution failed. Ironically, one of the reasons also why it failed, the ANC didn't get their 2/3 majority in order to amend Section 25. And one of the reasons why it failed was because the EFF did not support it. And they did not support it because their view of nationalizing land was not included in the amendment. So that's kind of the background. However, the ANC then realized that there's a piece of legislation called the Expropriation Act of 1985. And then they embarked on a process to amend the Expropriation Act of 1985. And so they amended that piece of legislation, the Expropriation Act, to include expropriation without compensation, with 5 scenarios where expropriation without compensation, with no compensation, was allowed. Bearing in mind that the Constitution calls for just and equitable, Section 25 of the Constitution calls for just and equitable compensation where expropriation does take place. So you had then the Expropriation Act of 1985 was then amended to include if land was being used for speculative purposes, speculation purposes, that land could be expropriated. Right. So the lander's land, you're waiting for the value of the land to increase before you sell it. That kind of land could be expropriated. Secondly, if land had been considered to be abandoned, could be expropriated. Thirdly, if the value of the market value of the land was equal to or less than the subsidy that was given by government, that land also could be expropriated. And if the land was considered to have health or safety hazards, land could be expropriated. But the expropriation had to be for the public good. And so that particular bill, which only required, or that the bill, the act itself, which became the amendment, which became an act, only required a majority, a 50+1%, which the ANC actually had at the time. They didn't need any other political party to support them, and so the act was passed with the amendments. It's going to be, and we've always argued as the ACDP that on three areas. One, the ethics and the morality of the amendment. We believe that it was wrong because when you begin to change legislation, and an expropriation without compensation affects productive farmlands, where with the change comes a loss also of employment, a loss of production, which affects the food security in South Africa. And so from an ethical and a moral view, I think the ACDP took a very objective view and understood that from a scientific, evidence-based, looking at scenario cases around the world, including Zimbabwe, right on our doorstep, that this is a recipe for disaster. But secondly, from an economic view, and maybe Steve, I won't touch on that, maybe Steve could just speak on the capital flight issue. And maybe Steve also the legislative factors. So that's Steve's forte. But I think based on those 3 areas, the ACDP, so a moral, ethical view, the economic view, and the legislative view, we believe that it was not necessary to include the expropriation without compensation in the Expropriation Act.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Wayne. That's fascinating. Yeah, it's quite a complex issue. And so thank you for unpacking that. Yeah. Steve.
Yes, Brett, and thank you, Wayne, for explaining that. Just to take a step back, as a faith organization, we did support the initial 1994 legislation, which was the Restitution of Land Act with compensation. So if any community was dispossessed of land under the apartheid laws, and they could prove that dispossession, they could claim the land, and the owners would be compensated, or they were compensated financially. And a lot of very successful cases and restitutions took place Some of that is still ongoing, but then sadly, there was a lot of corruption involved in that as well. And then the state started to run out of money to pay compensation. And then they started to say, well, let's rather have expropriation without compensation.
Yeah.
But that has not succeeded, besides what Wayne has pointed out. It's very important that Section 25 was not amended. So even though the legislation was amended, it is still subject to Section 25, which protects property rights. Now, it is also very important that whilst policy uncertainty in that area did result in a degree of disinvestment, there is still very strong portfolio investment in South Africa, in our bonds and equities. Lesser so is foreign direct investment in capital investment, although that is improving now since 2024 elections, where we've now got a government of national unity, where the previous governing party, the African National Congress, did not receive a majority and had to enter into more market-oriented party policies with those parties in government. So they've been able to put pressure on government to start adopting more business-sensitive, investor-friendly policies to attract foreign direct investment and not just portfolio inflows. And, of course, to address the fiscal position relating to our debt. And I'm very pleased to say in the last 2 years, the debt is stabilizing, that has resulted in an improvement in our sovereign ratings agencies in the first time in 20 years, which is significant for any organization or company looking to invest in South Africa. The very other important issue is, of course, that government, the new government, the GNU, has recognized that the land issue, which was very prominent in the US when our president visited President Trump, and I think that that has really brought to the fore the issue of the uncertainty in policy. And what is significant now is that there's an amendment before Parliament, and it's called the Prevention of Illegal Eviction and Unlawful Occupation of Land Act. And this goes back to 1998. And its view, its mainly is to protect property owners from unlawful land invasions and to restore investor and property owner confidence. And I'm sure that Wayne would be aware of this as well, that is coming. So there's a shift taken place to understand the importance of property rights in South Africa. And what we are seeing is foreign direct investment, obviously not where we would like it to be there, but there's a lot more capital investment taking place, such as down the road from where Wayne lives, Durban Harbour is now a private company. Philippines, the biggest container company in the world, is starting to terminal is starting to run that. We see Transnet, private investment in rails, Eskom, private investment in energy. So that's a massive ideological shift that has taken place. And that's very positive for the future of the country. I think significantly from my area of a budget perspective is the fact that we've now got a primary budget surplus, which is very important. And that has, as I indicated, resulted in an improvement in our sovereign ratings agencies. And for the first time, debt is stabilizing at a very high level, sure. But as I've said in my speeches on our budget to the minister, the ship is starting to turn in the right direction, slowly. And that's very positive. And bear in mind that we, as the ACDP, are not in the government of national unity. We form the centrist, constructive opposition. So we give credit where credit is due, as well as a faith-based organization. But there are straightforward principles such as stewardship of state resources, servant leadership that we stand for. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a background.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think it's very interesting when you talk about the shift that's taking place, because in reality, when I grew up in South Africa, it was really a quasi-government controlled economy because of all the state-owned enterprises, So, we have the ESCOMs, the post office, there was a bunch of others and then so many boards, a dairy marketing board, a this board, a meat board, a that board. I remember one of the most stupid advertisements I ever remember was the meat board running an ad. They had people around a table dressed in different national dresses, and their slogan was, "The world unites around pork," which is probably the most divisive meat that there is. But anyway, you had all of these crazy things, but you might remember those. But shifting out of a quasi-government control, I think at one stage, I mean, a third of the population the working population was employed by the government in some way. And to get back to a more market-driven situation as the state-owned enterprises have been falling on their faces is an encouraging sign. And, with the operators in Transnet and the ports that are taking place in Africa. Why this is important, Steve, I'm glad you brought it up, is because when we think about investing from a faith-based perspective in Africa, a lot of people work on the small things, but unless you deal with the ports, power, some of the other bigger things, you don't create an environment where the smaller things can be sustained. So I'm glad that you've been unpacking that. And also your point about way back about restitution versus redistribution. Do you want to tell us more about that? So you were in favor of restitution, but not in favor of redistribution. Is that right? As a party?
No, absolutely. And I think that would take us back to the biblical concept of restitution for wrongs having been committed, a sense of justice.
Yeah.
Going back to the principles in Exodus, feeling very strongly about that. But as our leader, Reverend Kenneth Meshwe, said, two wrongs cannot make a right. Mm-hmm. In other words, the wrongs of apartheid and then now wrongs of expropriation without compensation.
Yeah.
That could never be a Christian response. And that is, so what we supported was the initial restitution, but with full compensation to those from whom land would be taken. In fact, you'd be very interested that last week, a significant restitution framework agreement was entered into relating to the Kruger National Park, which celebrated 100 years and is probably one of the most world-renowned Kruger game parks in the world. And there was a restitution claim of people who used to live there during when it was founded. And there's a framework scheme agreement to benefit those communities whilst retaining the conservation status of the Kruger National Park, but surrounding communities who agreed not to reclaim the land, but to benefit from the conservation and the fees that are generated. And I think that is very significant. Now, interestingly, the far left political parties criticized it and said, we want the land to be given back. And the minister, who is a GNU minister, not from the ANC, made it very clear that these parties hadn't even spoken to the local communities who supported this process of restitution, and the local traditional leaders supported it. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and I think it's very positive for the future of South Africa that we are able, and this is an example, and I spoke in that debate, and I said, let this be a model for peaceful resolution of the emotional land issue whilst retaining the tourism market for the Kruger National Park, but also benefiting local communities who will then also help safeguard the animals on the Kruger National Park from poaching and other incidents like that. So it's a very, very positive development.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
If I may just indicate just one of the things, maybe one or two things, just to add on to what Steve has indicated. that while the ship has been turned in the right direction, as Steve has said, post the GNU being established in South Africa, I think that we cannot ignore the fact that the period post 1994 to date, where the Restitution of Land Rights Act was actually passed, and the process of restitution took place. You had also the Kgalema Motlanthe, former deputy president and also acting president of South Africa, who was instructed to look into land question. And one of the things that he found was that in that restitution process of land, the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform at the time, Kgalema Motlanthe found that, and it's within the Land Panel report, that there was huge corruption, huge incompetence with the land officials, and as a result of this incompetence and corruption, it delayed the process where restitution needed to take place speedily via the land courts. It was not being done because of the incompetence and the corruption. And I think that particular delay, as well as the delay, so that delay has hurt South Africans, number one. And secondly, during that particular process, it is estimated that some 2 trillion rand of domestic investment is still in the hands of South African businesses. So the liquidity amount that is possible for reinvestment in South Africa sits at some 2 trillion.
Yeah.
But that has also been delayed. So you've had a delay on the restitution of land, and you've also had a delay on investment, not only domestic investment, but also international or foreign direct investment into the economy. That, I believe, has also contributed to the slow growth of our economy over the last decade of around 1%, 1% of GDP growth over the last decade or so. One must also admit, however, during the period of Thabo Mbeki, that we had on average, with Trevor Manuel and so on being the finance minister, the GDP growth was sitting at around 3%. And employment during his tenure grew by about 5 to 6 million people that were added to the employment sector. And we've actually seen the reverse taking place. So the delay of financial investment, the delay in speeding up the process of restitution, policy uncertainty. I think Steve made reference to the tension that currently exists between the Constitution and the Expropriation Act, where the Constitution allows for expropriation with compensation, just equitable expropriation process. But your Expropriation Act allows for expropriation with no compensation. So this also creates this kind of policy uncertainty, and it has hindered economic growth in South Africa.
Yeah, well, Wayne, good point, because investors hate uncertainty. I mean, that's one of the things that they hate, and sounds like your South African investors, your corporates, your institutions and so on, that are sitting on a lot of money. They're just sitting on it, waiting for the other shoe to drop, as it were. And some time ago, perhaps you can comment on this, when I was doing some research, I found that of the land that had been expropriated, a vast majority of it was still sitting in government hands and not actually pushed back to people who might be beneficial, farmers, etc. Is that also
Absolutely.
what you...
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that the studies, the question that was asked to Parliament in terms of what is the percentage of land that is now sitting in the hands of the South Africans, or those who actually had applied for the land, for the redistribution of the land, restitution of land. So here's the statistics. The South African government is sitting with some 8 million hectares of land. Just over about 5 million of those hectares, that's additional land, sitting with some 17 million, but the 8 million came from the restitution redistribution process. Restitution process, some 5 million hectares. Redistribution process, some 3 million hectares. That contributes the 8 million hectares that was added to government's land, which brings it up to about 18 million hectares that is owned by the state. Now, of the land that was in that redistribution restitution process, it is said that 90% of the applicants, 90% opted for cash.
Yeah.
So they've made application for the land, but when and in terms of the act, the restitution of land rights act, finance is one of the options that they could settle for. 90% of the applicants chose to take the land, chose to take cash, not the land.
Wow.
Of the 10% who chose to take the land, only 10% of that 10%
Wow.
actually are still on the land productively farming it. So where there was productive land that was taken, in other words, of every 100 applicants that applied for land, only one is on the land productively utilizing the land to benefit communities, to ensure the security of food in the country, and also to create employment. So those are the current statistics, which is quite shameful. But government will not speak of it, and because obviously of the ideological position that they take, which blinds the evidence-based position, I think that we need to be able to put in place to ensure that South Africa continues on the right trajectory, decreasing poverty, increasing employment, and also decreasing inequality in the land.
Wow. Back in 2018, I was flying over Zimbabwe just in a light aircraft. So, going from Harare to the eastern part of Zimbabwe. And you look down and you just see what used to be massive farms, like terraced laid out. And then you'd see a house and you'd see about a hectare of millies of maize, just growing around that. The rest of it was just unused. It was a bit of a travesty just watching that. And there's a lot of stories of what happened in Zimbabwe, but that's a terrible percentage, because that's 1% at the bottom end of the day of the land is being used productively. And it's a bit of a dilemma for me, because what I see in scripture, Wayne and Steve, is that, when the nation of Israel moved out of Egypt into the promised land, God told them, the land is mine. You get to steward it, but it's actually mine. And God seems to reserve the prerogative to allocate land to those who are going to be the best stewards. And so from a governance perspective in South Africa, if you're looking at the situation and you look at the inventory of all of the land, one should surely be asking oneself, who would be the best stewards of this land for the good of the nation, if you look at it from a national perspective? And I just don't know how that practically comes into play, but what comes to my mind is two things. One is, I don't know if you've been up to Rwanda, but I was up there last year. They have an interesting thing, Wayne, you mentioned about where land is being held speculatively, or, it's just not being used. So then what do you do with it? And I think this is a big problem up in Namibia, where I think about 70% of the land is owned by people who don't live in the country, which is an issue. This goes back into their history as a German colony. And And that's a problem for the local people. Up in Rwanda, they have an interesting policy, which I think would be a hard one to pull off in South Africa, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Let's just say you own a piece of land in Kigali or in the town, and you plan to build a house. You're going to build the Thring family compound or something, but you haven't started building. You own it. You have the property rights. You're putting your plans together. Until such time as you start to build, people can grow crops on your land. They can't put a structure. They can't put an informal settlement. They can't put up a shack or a home. But they can plant with the understanding that as soon as you say, okay, I want to start digging the foundations, putting in the trenches, laying the bricks and so on, they're gone. So it's a very interesting system. So everywhere you go, stuff is growing.
Yeah.
Which is a fascinating concept versus 1%. That's a travesty. It's a real.
Yeah, I think I do think it's an interesting concept. And one of the challenges is where you do not have, and while South Africa, the legislative framework to a large extent supports property rights, particularly from a constitutional view. So property rights are protected in South Africa. The problem comes in, is in the implementation of the legislation, and we see that also at times with the proliferation of illegal settlements in different parts of the country. We had an illegal settlement when I was in public works and infrastructure. We had an illegal settlement that grew and was founded on land that belonged to the military. And based on the legislation that we currently have, you cannot move those the folk from there unless adequate accommodation could be found for them. And so here you have an informal settlement on land occupied by the military, and it had other implications because they then began to tap into the electricity lines that were running to the military base and the water, and so those in the military were being restricted in terms of their power and their water, and the morale of the soldiers that were there was beginning to drop. But there was that problem. So I think that if we are able to kind of balance the enforcement of legislation. And I think in Rwanda they don't have that problem of enforcement. And I think if we were able to get that right, I think that we would be on the path to success, greater success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I wanted to mention two very interesting aspects, and that is the increasing and where we have governed as the ACDP at a local government level, where we have insisted on the transfer of property rights and title deeds in township areas, where people have stayed there for many, many years and they never got the title deeds. And we've been able to really ensure that, and there's an increasing number of people that are receiving title deeds, and that once you receive a title deed to a small property, you've got capital. You can unlock capital. Then you can have a loan on that title deed, a small loan. You can start a small business. So that is a massive, massive tool for your local township, your small businesses, your entrepreneurs to unlock value there. And I think that is something that we need to improve on. It is increasing in South Africa, which is a fundamental ideological shift from a previous view that the government owns all the property. Now to increase more and more, or should own all the property, as Wayne indicated when there was the move to amend the Constitution of Section 25, that the government should be custodian of all land. No. Private property is very important in South Africa and is protected in terms of our Constitution. However, there's still the issue of state land, as Wayne pointed out, and communal land that still exists under traditional authorities. Now, one of which is the Ngomyana Trust in KZN, which still falls, and it was a crucial part of the settlement negotiations in the run-up to the 1994 elections. And that still largely falls under communal area and communal traditional authorities, and it's very successful, I would argue, in values, in safety and security, whilst there isn't private property ownership there, but there are moves to try to break those traditional community structures down, which we would not support.
Yeah, yeah.
There's also the example of the Bafokeng tribe in the Rustenburg area that owns about 120,000 hectares, and they have very successfully, with all the platinum mines there, it's one of the richest tribal authorities in Southern Africa because they own a lot of mineral wealth, and they've really been good stewards of that. So there's some very good successful stories from South Africa, despite what one hears internationally. And that is why we are starting to see more investment, although the point is very well made by Wayne that our private companies are almost adopting a wait-and-see attitude. It's maintenance as opposed to more investment. We've gone somewhere along the path with foreign direct investment, but we could have been far further had it not been for ideological shifts, which now, with the government of national unity, is being starkly contested, where the previous governing party cannot just do what they want to do.
Yeah. It's fascinating because just for overseas listeners, the concept of a bit of a three-legged stool. So you got private ownership, Wayne owns a piece of land, he's got the title to that, or you've got a piece of land where you have a factory, and then you've got government ownership and that whole issue. But in between this concept of rural historical tribes where the chief effectively in Africa, and this is up into Africa, the chief owns the land in the town. It's not all the people and so forth. And your point, Steve, I think we've seen quite a few public-private partnerships and where trusts are set up for these communal lands where they get into, say, a property development or a mining application. So this is another factor, and in some cases offsets the risk of just the government owns it or the government could take my land. This is a buffering situation where you've got a relationship with a smart local communal property ownership structure that then creates new opportunities. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think it's very important. And as one then looks at the greatest challenge in South Africa and probably across the world is your economic growth levels and high levels of unemployment and poverty in South Africa. And the land issue is crucial to that. And that is why we see a strong move to stabilize investor confidence, address land uncertainty as far as possible, and really encouraging that our constitutional rights in terms of property rights were not changed. Although legislation might be changed, it can still be tested against that. And we are seeing foreign capital being invested in South Africa. We are the gateway to Africa. We've got strong institutions, strong capital markets. A lot of our debt is rand denominated, not foreign denominated. So I think that's what's resulted in the sovereign ratings agencies improving our rating first time in 20 years. So the ship is starting to turn slowly in the right direction, but we could have been, and that's the point Wayne makes, we could have been far further down the track in 30 years had it not been for ideological positions of socialism that would go against your private sector, private property rights. But that's been brought to a stark stop now with the government of national unity. And whilst there are criticisms even of that, I think in the broader context, and I'm speaking purely from a fiscal position, that the ship of public debt and is starting to stabilize, because sadly, from a government expenditure perspective, we've been spending too much money on debt service costs, and that's a worldwide problem. And for the first time, that's starting to stabilize, where you can unlock more money for service delivery as opposed to debt service costs.
Yeah.
Brett, maybe if I could just add to what Steve has said, I think one also needs to note that the Expropriation Act, which allows for expropriation of land without compensation, is also being challenged. There is a political party. I'm not going to mention the name because I don't want to necessarily give them airtime. But there's a political party that has actually taken the process and to court, and is currently in court, as well as AfriForum. And it's purely because of what the act says, the legislation says, as opposed to what the Constitution says. And as Steve indicated earlier, the Constitution will always trump. It's the highest legislative guidance, I suppose, in the country, and the Constitution will always trump your acts and legislation at a municipal or at a provincial level, and even at a national level. So it is being challenged, and so let's keep an eye on that, and we may have a positive outcome if it's successfully challenged within the courts of South Africa.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting, back in 2018, when I first published the book, a chap I knew, I'd got to name Dr. Vern Hinman, did a review of the book, and he told me, a white guy from South Africa talking about land, this is going to be a terrible book. You know, he was honest with me afterwards. But actually, he read the book, and then he came to me and he said, Brett, I think this is going to be an issue in the United States 10 years from now. And it's quite interesting. When you look at Australia, for example, I have friends in Australia. Every government meeting, if you're having a municipal meeting, you start the meeting acknowledging that you're on stolen land sort of situation. There's a lot of verbiage in the US among college students because they've had this fed into their heads. Oh, we're on stolen land. Now, none of them want to give their house back or their apartment or anything. You know, you've got this, like you get greenwashing on the climate issues or whatever. This is an emotive issue that has been picked up in other parts of the world and can become a problem. Now, sometimes, you know, restitution, there's been a case in California where the government took land from an African-American / black family, and they ended up doing some sort of golf course development or whatever. This was 100 years ago, and that compensation has been paid out. So there are some of those things. But generally, it's become like an emotive, a cool issue to talk about, but there's no actual action that takes place. And so it would be interesting to see if South Africa can nail this one and solve this one, if that also creates some parameters or guidelines for other parts of the world where this is becoming a sort of an in vogue topic, if you like.
Brett, I think the point you make is very, if I may, Wayne, just come in there quickly.
Sure, I'll hold my thought.
Go ahead.
I just want just a quick thought. Another survey also, Brett, just on that, the land being an emotive issue. A survey was done about 2 or 3 years ago, and you know, asking what are the top priorities that government needs to be addressing. And so this was a widely distributed, reliable survey, and the outcome of that survey indicated that land, for the vast majority of South Africans, was not even in the top 5.
Wow.
So it was employment, it was education, it was housing, health issues. So those were the top issues that South Africans were wanting to be addressed in the country, and land wasn't even in that top. So I think it's quite interesting. It was a quite interesting result from that particular survey. However, as you said, I think it is emotive, and there are some political parties who would push that emotional button for their own ideological and political purposes.
Yeah.
Brett, yes, I think what is encouraging is the fact that South Africans are predominantly Christian. And that's why a book where you lay out the biblical basis of land ownership would resonate. And that is one of the blessings of South Africa, is the majority of South Africans are conservative. And the biggest challenge is economic growth, job creation, poverty. Once we deal with that, and once we have the investment, which is based on private property rights with a combination of rural, communal land, state land, the success story is there, and it can be a model for other countries. Sadly, political parties, certain far left-wing political parties, are using the land issue as an emotive issue to draw support to them, with the promise that if we get the land back, then everything will be fine. And as the data has indicated, it's not so. A lot of the land that has been given back and farms that have been given back have not been successful. And that's for a variety of reasons, So one doesn't want to necessarily blame emerging farmers for that. Lack of capital access, credit, is a lot of experience. But I think the point being that there have been some successful restitution of land projects. The process being a biblically based process of restitution with compensation does bring a blessing upon it for restitution. Yes, we as white South Africans, we can ask for forgiveness for what was done in the past, going back to the 1914 Land Act. But restitution is an issue of justice. Restitution with compensation. And I think that once you start implementing that, and you exclude all the corruption that Wayne referred to, and you start having models, and there are some incredible partnerships between existing farmers, emerging farmers, incredible projects, great success stories, but you don't see that publicized enough because of the emotive issue around the land issue that has been used. So I think there is, and there can be, a story of success where one starts looking at those projects that have been successful. I mentioned the Bafokeng, massively successful, and we look forward, and the Kruger National Park issue as well. But at the end of the day, our property rights are still protected, and in fact are being further protected with the legislation that I referred to, the PI Act, Prevention of Illegal Eviction and Unlawful Occupation of Land Act. Very, very important for investor confidence to protect private property rights in South Africa.
That's a great perspective. Yeah. So two thoughts as we wrap up over here. I think about the privatization or the operators being able to run on Transnet infrastructure, and the also, with the GNU, with the clearing of the backlog of passports and visas and things like that. Could there be a specific working group that combined government and the private sector to try to deal with this backlog of the land issue? Is that something that you could put on the table? So that's a question. And then Steve, since you mentioned biblical principles around land and so on, that's my challenge for both of you, which I didn't tell you about beforehand. So I'll watch your faces as I mention it. I'll send you each 50 copies of the land book if you get them into the hands of people who need to understand the biblical concepts of land. I've got them sitting in South Africa. I'll happily ship them to you. Just give me your address via Postnet or whatever, and I'll send it off to you, because I would love to see these principles. Because at the end of the day, if we violate God's principles around banking, finance, economics, land, investment, we can't get a good outcome. I mean, we can have political policies, we can have things that look politically appealing, we can have things that feel good, etc. But if we violate these basic principles, then obviously we don't get a good result. So if you're up for the challenge, I'll send each of you 50 books, and you prayerfully get them into the hands of the right people. That would be fantastic.
Well, I think very clearly, Brett, firstly, thank you. That's an easy challenge. I think that within the spheres that both myself and Steve work, there are a number of influences within the country, from a political economic business sector, as well as within the NGO, faith-based organizations, churches that we work amongst. It's an obvious yes from me. It's quite easy to get that into the right hands. But maybe just to come back to your question about whether it is possible for a broader working group, like we see the success with the logistics sector, Transnet and at our ports and so on, and how there's been improvements when the private sector was brought on board. I think yes. I mean, the answer is yes. If we were able to get this broad block, which includes the private sector, who would be able to say, this is what we as the private sector would be able to do, noting that I think your gross capital formation ought to be in the region of about 30% of GDP, and is currently sitting at I think around about 14-15%. So which is an indication of the inability of both foreign as well as direct investment, particularly in infrastructure. Now, if we are able to pull this together and have this broad support group, which includes the private sector, to deal with the land question, who are able to say, this is the amount that we are able to invest, these are the amount of jobs that we are able to create, it would be make it very difficult for government to refuse such a proposal. So I think, yes, I think that also is something that needs to be looked at. Although, Steve, I don't know whether there are any, and I haven't heard of any, private sector involvement in the land question with regards to, redistribution, restitution, and so on, in terms of that particular debate. But I would agree. I think it's an important and a good idea to look at implementing.
Brett, again, thanks for those books. I loved reading your book previously. I think it can really be helpful. In South Africa, we prayed in a new South Africa in 1994 when the country was facing a low-level civil war. God intervened, and as we come back to his principles, as you pointed out, there will be blessings upon the nation. And I just want to emphasize that South Africa's got a very strong institutions. We've got a very strong banking sector, financial sector. We've got a very independent judiciary that has instructed Parliament to continue with the impeachment of the president. In African context, that is not something that is it's unusual. We've got an independent institutions, an independent judiciary, independent Chapter 9 institutions, a very strong media, and I think we've got a very strong agricultural sector as well. Food security is very important in South Africa. And when we did the hearings on the land issues, and it's an ongoing issue, Agri South Africa, which is a very, very big agricultural organization, is involved in a lot of discussions with emerging farmers, with assisting where land is bought or given back with restitution to ensure that those farmers do succeed. And there are many, many successful stories. So there's a lot of positive developments, but I think the broader context, again, at different levels of government, at local government level, you've got municipalities that are giving back title deeds. It's very important. Even at provincial and national level, maybe it could happen more and quicker, but it's an ongoing issue. And the private sector has been brought on board in a number of areas to assist government, such as dealing with crime, such as dealing with other areas and economic growth, and dealing with the economic growth constraints, like you pointed out. Eskom, largely due to private sector involvement in energy, Transnet. Now you've got the minerals export companies that are coming alongside transport to help them to resolve the logistics crises. So it's already happening to a large degree. And I think it's happening to a certain degree with the land issue, and it can be increased. And I do believe that we are going to see a successful resolution of the land issue. I really believe there are a lot of prayerful people in South Africa. And whilst we have many challenges, just for your foreigners that are watching this, I really believe that South Africa is a place to watch. It's a place to consider investing in, and not just portfolio flows into the bonds and equities, but with foreign direct investment.
Fantastic. Well, Steve, I think that's a good way to wrap us up for today. Wayne, do you have any final thoughts on top of that?
Well, I just want to echo what Steve has said, is that, South Africa is, and I think, Brett, you've covered that also in your book, South Africa is a land of opportunity. Whereas there are many African countries where the risk is quite high. South Africa does not have those particular challenges that our neighbors further north actually have. And so while we do have issues of high unemployment and poverty and inequality and some spots of crime that other nations are not immune to, South Africa is a land of huge opportunity, potential, a population that has just immense possibility in terms of growth. All of the indicators indicate that if we just, at this particular point of inflection, if we just make the right decisions, godly decisions, and trust in the Lord for those decisions and seek His face, at that point of inflection, the only way for South Africa is up in terms of our economic growth.
Thank you so much. Well, Wayne, Steve, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your stories. I greatly appreciate it. And I'm sure this will be a puzzle piece that helps inform people as we think about investing with Africa. So much appreciated. Thank you for being with me today.